The fluorescent lights of the emergency department hummed with a frequency that only Talia seemed to hear, a low-grade mosquito whine that burrowed into the base of her skull. At 27, wearing light blue scrubs that were 2 sizes too big, a deliberate choice to hide the athletic, coiled tension of her frame, she looked like exactly what Dr. Eris Thorne said she was, a diversity hire who belonged in the cafeteria, not the trauma bay. She stood by the nurse's station, clutching a clipboard to her chest, her dark eyes lowered as Thorne berated her in front of the morning shift. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and stale coffee, a sterile purgatory where hierarchy was the only religion. Thorne was tall, blonde, and possessed the kind of jawline that suggested he had never been told no in his entire life. He flicked the chart in Talia's hand, the paper rattling aggressively. "I asked for the vitals on the tachycardia patient in bed 4, Nurse Williams," Thorne sneered, his voice carrying down the hallway, ensuring the other nurses, the giggling chorus who nicknamed her the Ghost, could hear every syllable. Not a dissertation on his dietary habits. "You are here to record numbers, not to think. Thinking requires equipment you clearly lack." Talia didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just adjusted her grip on the plastic clipboard, her knuckles not even whitening, her expression a mask of practiced vacuity. "The patient isn't just tachycardic, doctor," she said, her voice soft, barely a whisper, forcing him to lean in, which only annoyed him more. "His pulse pressure is narrowing. I suspect a pericardial effusion." The dietary note was regarding his high sodium intake, which complicates the... Thorne cut her off with a laugh that sounded like dry ice cracking. He looked around at the other staff, inviting them to share in the joke. "Dr. Thorne," he corrected, pointing a manicured finger at his ID badge. "And if I want a diagnosis, I'll ask a doctor. Go empty the bedpans in the staging area. That seems more your speed. Do not speak to me again unless the building is on fire." As he turned his back, dismissing her like she was furniture, Talia's eyes shifted. For a microsecond, the submissive mask slipped, revealing a predatory sharpness, a cold calculation that assessed Thorne's jugular, his stance, and the 3 seconds it would take to dismantle his ego permanently. But she exhaled, the moment passing, and walked silently toward the sluice room. She was good at being invisible. It was the only way to stay alive after what she had left behind. But the universe, it seemed, had no intention of letting her stay hidden in the shadows of the linen closet. The disruption began not with a scream, but with a vibration. It started in the floorboards, a subtle trembling that rattled the instruments on the metal trays in Trauma 1. Talia paused, her hands deep in a sink of soapy water, and tilted her head. It wasn't an earthquake. The rhythm was too consistent. It was a thrumming, a rhythmic beating of the air that grew louder with every heartbeat.
Reitevais.
The realization hit her with the familiarity of an old scar. Outside the sliding glass doors of the ambulance bay, the bright, cloudless skies suddenly darkened, not by clouds, but by a massive, descending shadow. The wind picked up instantly, whipping debris across the parking lot, sending trash cans skittering into parked cars. Inside the ER, the confusion was immediate. Alarms on the monitors blipped erratically as the power flickered. Dr. Thorne looked up from his tablet, his face twisting in annoyance. "What is that racket?" he barked, as if he could demand the noise to cease by sheer force of personality. "Security, find out who is drilling outside, and shut it down." But it wasn't a drill. It was the roar of a heavy transport helicopter, a sleek, black beast of a machine that had no business being in a civilian zone, plummeting toward the pavement right outside the main entrance. Talia dried her hands slowly, her movements precise. While the other nurses ran to the windows, pressing their faces against the glass, and patients began to shout in panic, she moved to the crash cart. She checked the seal on the defibrillator. She counted the epinephrine ampoules. She knew that sound. That wasn't a medevac. That was a private extraction bird, flying low and hard, pushing the engine to the red line. The sound went from a thrum to a deafening roar that shook the dust from the ceiling tiles. The glass doors of the entrance rattled violently in their frames. Outside, the black helicopter flared hard, the skid screeching against the asphalt mere inches from the sliding doors, kicking up a storm of grit and exhaust fumes that blocked out the sun. The sheer audacity of the landing froze everyone in the lobby. This wasn't protocol, this was an invasion. The engine didn't shut down. The rotors kept spinning, a deadly halo of noise that screamed urgency. The side door of the chopper slid open before the skids even settled, and men in dark suits spilled out, moving with the chaotic, desperate energy of soldiers who were losing a battle. In the center of the storm, a man jumped out, carrying another body in his arms. He didn't duck under the rotors. He walked tall, his face a portrait of terrified fury. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than the hospital, but the white dress shirt was soaked in crimson. The sliding doors were forced open by the sheer force of the entourage, the automatic sensors overwhelmed. The wind from the rotors blasted into the sterile hallway, sending papers flying like confetti and blowing the sterile caps off the nurses' heads. Leading the charge was the man in the bloody suit, Jason. He was striking, with sharp, aristocratic features and eyes that burned with a lethal intensity, but right now, he looked like a man watching his world burn. He cradled a younger man in his arms, a boy really, whose chest was a ruin of torn fabric and dark, oozing blood. "Help!" Jason roared, his voice cracking, raw with emotion that cut through the mechanical scream of the helicopter outside. "I need a surgeon. Now." Behind him, 3 large men with earpieces and bulges under their jackets formed a perimeter, their eyes scanning the lobby for threats, effectively taking the waiting room hostage with their presence. Dr. Thorne, recovering from his initial shock, puffed out his chest and marched forward, his white coat flapping in the dying wind of the rotor wash. He held up a hand, the universal gesture for stop, completely misreading the room. "You cannot bring a vehicle like that here," Thorne shouted, his voice shrill. "This is a place of healing, not a hangar. You are violating federal airspace regulations and hospital protocol. Get that man out of here and call 911 like a normal person." Jason didn't even slow down. He marched straight up to Thorne, his eyes wild, and shoved the doctor aside with his shoulder, sending the man stumbling into a row of plastic chairs. "He is dying," Jason screamed, laying the boy onto the nearest gurney, his hand shaking as he pressed a silk handkerchief into the wound. "I don't care about your protocols. Save him, or I will burn this building down with everyone inside." The threat wasn't hyperbolic. The cold steel in his tone suggested he had the means and the will to do exactly that. The security guards, 2 older men named Gary and Bob who were used to breaking up drunken arguments, stood frozen, their hands hovering uselessly over their tasers, paralyzed by the aura of violence radiating from the newcomers. Thorne scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. "Security! Remove them!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I will not be threatened in my own hospital. This is a criminal matter." The nurses backed away, terrified. The ghost remained by the crash cart, watching. She saw what Thorne missed. She saw the way the blood was pumping, bright red, spurting in time with a fading heart. She saw the pallor of the boy's skin, turning from alabaster to gray. Protocol was death. Time was a luxury they didn't have. Thorne approached the gurney, not to help, but to obstruct. He placed a hand on the rail, blocking the path to the trauma bay. "I said get out," Thorne hissed, his ego overriding his survival instinct. "We do not treat gangsters who storm in here like animals." "You are compromising the sterility of my unit." Jason looked at Thorne, and for a second, he looked ready to draw the weapon that was clearly tucked into his waistband. The desperation in the handsome man's face was heartbreaking, a king begging a peasant for water. "Please," Jason whispered, the fight draining out of him as fear took over. "He's my brother." He's not breathing right," Thorne sneered, sensing weakness. "Then he should have made better life choices. Move him." Now that was the trigger. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. From the shadows of the nurse's station, a figure moved. It wasn't the hesitant shuffle of Nurse Williams. It was a fluid, kinetic glide. Talia stepped between the weeping mob boss and the arrogant doctor. She didn't look at Thorne. She looked directly at the wound. Tension pneumothorax with a subclavian artery nick, she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the soft, submissive lilt she had faked for months. It was a command voice, resonant and absolute. He has less than 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. Thorne gaped at her. Williams, get back to the linen closet. You are unauthorized to. Shut up, Talia said. She didn't shout it. She simply stated it as a fact, snapping her head to look at him with eyes that were suddenly terrifyingly empty of fear. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Jason blinked, looking down at the woman in the oversized blue scrubs who had just silenced the loudest man in the room. Talia turned to Jason. Up close, the chemistry was instantaneous and violent, a collision of two high-pressure systems. He smelled of expensive cologne, copper blood, and aviation fuel. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. He saw a soldier. You, Jason breathed, his dark eyes locking onto hers, searching for a lifeline. Can you save him? Talia didn't hesitate. She reached out, her hand brushing his stained shirt as she grabbed the gurney rail. Her touch was firm, grounding him. Hold pressure here, she ordered, physically guiding his hand deeper into the wound. Harder. Don't let up even if he screams. She looked up at him, her face inches from his. I can save him. But you need to do exactly what I say. No questions.
No threats.
Just compliance.
Can you do that?
Jason nodded, entranced by the sudden shift in reality. The mouse had become a dragon. I'm yours, he said, the words slipping out with a weight that implied more than just the medical context. Talia spun around, her oversized scrubs billowing. Trauma 1 is compromised. We go to Trauma 2, she barked, pointing at the terrified nurses. Sarah, get the thoracotomy tray.
Now.
Do not wait for an attending. Open it. She pointed at another nurse. Start 2 large-bore IVs, 18 gauge. Pressure bag the oneg. If you miss the vein, drill the IO. Move. She grabbed the gurney and began to run, pushing it with a strength that belied her size. Jason ran beside her, his hand still buried in his brother's chest, his eyes fixed on Talia's profile. Thorne stood in the hallway, stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish.
You
can't, Thorne stammered, his authority evaporating like mist. Talia ignored him completely. She kicked the doors of Trauma 2 open. Get me a scalpel and a chest tube. She ordered the room at large, her voice echoing off the tile. She jumped onto the gurney, straddling the dying boy's legs to get a better angle, ripping his shirt open with a savage efficiency. She looked at Jason, whose face was pale with shock. Don't look at the blood, she told him, her voice suddenly dropping to a strangely intimate, calm register amidst the chaos. Look at me. Keep your eyes on mine. Jason locked eyes with her, and in that exchange, amidst the beeping alarms and the smell of death, a pact was sealed. The silence in Trauma 2 was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, wet gasps of the dying boy and the high-pitched whine of the monitor flatlining intermittently. Talia didn't tremble. Her world had narrowed down to a 4-inch square of skin on the boy's chest. She snapped the plastic cover off the scalpel with her thumb, the sound loud in the terrified quiet of the room. I need suction ready on my right, she commanded, her voice devoid of the hesitation that had defined Nurse Williams. She looked at Jason, whose hands were still slick with his brother's blood, gripping the metal rails until his knuckles were white. Don't let go of him, she said softly, locking eyes with him for a fleeting second. He needs to feel you here. Anchors matter, Jason nodded, mesmerized by the transformation. The woman who had been mopping floors 10 minutes ago was now holding court with the authority of a field commander. Talia drove the blade down. Blood welled up, dark and fast, but her hands moved in a blur of terrifying efficiency. She wasn't just cutting, she was navigating a map she knew by heart. She inserted the spreader, the metal clicking against bone, and the room hissed as trapped air escaped the chest cavity, a gruesome, relieving sound that signaled the pressure was releasing. Tube, she snapped, extending a hand without looking up. The nurse, Sarah, pale and shaking, slapped the plastic tube into Talia's palm. With a fluid, brutal shove, Talia guided the tube between the ribs. The monitor's whine stuttered, then beeped.
Once. Twice.
A rhythm. Jason let out a breath that sounded like a sob, his shoulders sagging as the frantic rhythm of the heart monitor slowed to a steady, strong beat. The boy on the table groaned, his eyelids fluttering. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving the room in a state of vibrating aftershock. Talia didn't step back. She began to suture the incision, her movements changing from forceful to delicate, her fingers dancing with the needle. Jason watched her, not the brother he had just almost lost. He watched the way a bead of sweat rolled down her temple and how she ignored it, fully consumed by her craft. He had seen surgeons in the best private clinics in Seoul operate with arrogance and detachment, but this was different. This was intimate. She was fierce, protective, and utterly beautiful in the harsh glare of the trauma lights. He reached out, almost involuntarily, and with a clean corner of his cuff, he gently dabbed the sweat from her forehead. Talia froze for a heartbeat, her eyes darting to his. For the first time, the adrenaline shield dropped, and he saw the woman beneath the soldier, exhausted, wary, but accepting the touch. The air between them crackled, charged with a sudden, overwhelming intimacy that felt out of place in a room smelling of antiseptic and copper. "You brought him back," Jason whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears and a dawning fascination. "You are a witch," Talia finished the knot and snipped the thread. "I'm a nurse," she corrected quietly, though the word felt too small for what she had just done. "And he's stable. But he needs an or real surgeons, not a trauma patch." The moment was shattered as the double doors banged open. Dr. Thorne stood there, flanked by the 2 security guards and the hospital administrator, a sweating man in a cheap suit named Mr. Henderson. Thorne looked triumphant, pointing a shaking finger at Talia. "There she is." "Step away from the patient," he screamed, his face purple. "This is assault. She is a nurse. She is not authorized to perform invasive surgery. She has assaulted a patient and violated every code of conduct in this institution." The spell broke. Talia stepped back from the table, raising her bloody-gloved hands in a gesture of surrender, her face closing off again, the mask of the ghost sliding back into place. But Jason moved. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped between Talia and the door, using his body as a shield. He smoothed his suit jacket, wiped the blood from his hands onto a towel, and looked at Thorne with the cold, bored expression of a man who owned the building. "She saved his life while you were crying in the hallway," Jason said, his voice low and silky, carrying a menace that made the security guards take a step back. "If you touch her, you answer to me," Thorne scoffed, emboldened by the administrator's presence. "I don't care who you are," Thorne spat. "She is fired. She is liable.
And you are trespassing."
"Officer, arrest this woman for practicing medicine without a license." Mr. Henderson, the administrator, stepped forward nervously, looking at the monitors, then at the neat, military-grade suturing on the patient's chest. He blinked. "Actually," Henderson stammered, looking at Talia with confusion. That is a field thoracotomy. A perfect 1 inch." He looked at Thorne. "Dr. Thorne, the patient would be dead if she hadn't acted." Thorne turned on his boss, incredulous. "Are you defending the help? Look at her. She's a liability." Talia stripped off her gloves with a sharp snap that silenced the room. She walked to the sink, turning her back on them to scrub her hands. "The liability," she said, her voice echoing off the tiles, "was leaving a tension pneumothorax untreated for 4 minutes because you were too busy reading my badge instead of the patient's vitals." She turned around, drying her hands, her posture suddenly towering despite her height. "And I'm not a nurse." "Not really." She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a small, worn dog tag, tossing it onto the metal tray with a heavy clatter. "I was 68th Rescue Squadron.
Rescue.
I've done that procedure in the back of a burning Black Hawk while taking fire. Doing it in a clean room with AC was a vacation." She looked at Thorne, whose jaw had dropped. "I took this job for the quiet. You made it loud. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Thorne looked from the dog tags to Talia, his arrogance crumbling into fear as he realized he had been bullying a special operations veteran. Jason picked up the tags, his thumb brushing over the embossed letters. He looked at her with a new depth of reverence, a mixture of awe and desire burning in his dark eyes. He walked over to her, ignoring the sputtering doctor and the confused administrator. 68th Rescue, he mused, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. I have heard stories. The angels of death. He stepped closer, entering her personal space, but this time she didn't retreat. She held his gaze, her chin tilted up. We prefer guardian angels, she murmured. Jason chuckled, a low, warm sound. You are no angel, Talia, he said softly, using her name like it was a secret they shared. You are dangerous. And you are wasted here, he turned to the administrator. My organization will be covering all costs for this hospital stay. We will also be making a donation. A large one-inch, he paused, his eyes sliding back to Thorne, cold and hard as diamond. On the condition that this man is removed from his position immediately. Incompetence offends me, Henderson nodded vigorously, practically tripping over himself to agree. Thorne stood frozen, his career ending in a sterile room he thought he ruled, destroyed by the quiet woman he had mocked. A week later, the autumn wind was crisp, blowing leaves across the hospital parking lot. Talia walked out of the sliding glass doors for the last time, carrying a small cardboard box. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She wore a fitted leather jacket and jeans, her hair loose, looking every bit the warrior she had tried to hide. She had resigned an hour ago, despite Henderson's begging for her to stay. The quiet life was over. The itch was back. As she reached the curb, a sleek black sedan pulled up, the windows tinted dark. The rear door opened, and Jason stepped out. He looked different, softer, less frantic than the bloody man in the hallway, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him like armor. He waited for her, his hands clasped behind his back. My brother is asking for you, he said, skipping the pleasantries. He says the nurses in the VIP wing are too gentle. He wants the one who stabbed him. Talia smiled, a genuine, rare expression that lit up her face. He's complaining? That means he's healthy. Jason stepped closer, the magnetic pull between them undeniable. He reached out and took the box from her hands, placing it in the car, then turned back to her. I have a job for you, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that made her pulse jump. Not as a nurse.
As
a consultant. My world is dangerous. I need someone who doesn't flinch. He extended a hand, palm up. Come with me. Talia looked at the hospital, then at the hand of the man who looked at her like she was the only competent person on earth. She placed her hand in his. I don't come cheap, she warned playfully. Jason's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. I am counting on it. He led her into the car, and as they drove away, leaving the stunned staff watching from the windows, Talia didn't look back. She had found a new war, and this time, she wasn't fighting alone.